I'm honored to present this next topic. If you were in Salt Lake, you probably remember another CIP 14 topic and a lot of questions that followed. And so this is a commitment to answer a lot of the questions that came up in Salt Lake. So we brought back Jamie Calderon from NERC, Brady Phelps, and Tom Williams to discuss adjacency in CIP 14. So take it away.
Thank you, Deb. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. I had some awesome conversations last night. It's so fun to get together and see you and appreciate these opportunities a lot. As Deb mentioned, this session grew out of some questions at the Salt Lake workshop last spring, and we hope to address some of those questions. We're going to talk more than adjacency today, and that's the more in the title. And we have Jamie and Brady with us. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to do some introductions, and then I'll say a few things, and then we'll get right to the questions. I manage one of WEC's 3 audit teams. If this concept of 3 audit teams is new to you, you can see me or Sandra Revnol or Stacia Karen or Deb at a break, and we'll tell you what that's about. I'll leave it at that for now. And I'm going to pass first to Jamie for an introduction, and then we'll go to Brady.
All right. Is this on?
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, Jamie Calderon. I'm the Director of Standards Development here at NERC. We are obviously working on a lot of very complicated projects, new technologies, things speeding up. CIP 14 is one of those that fits a very specific set of criteria. But I've been with NERC since 2015. Previously, I was in compliance for 7 years, and prior to that, in reliability assessments. I do come from industry. I was with the municipality in Georgia doing some transmission planning and bulk power dispatch.
Thank you, Jamie. Brady.
Thank you. I'm Brady Phelps. I'm the Entity Monitoring Physical Security Lead at WEC, so I handle all of the physical security audits, low impact, CIP 6, CIP 14, but I also support the 3 new audit teams, the pods as we call them. So as they have physical security audits and needs that come up, my job is to be flexible and move around between the 3 teams and support them that way. Also, a big part of my job is bridging the gap between the other regions, if there is a gap, but kind of getting on the same page of how we audit physical security from RF to CERC to everybody in between. So happy to be here and to have this discussion with you.
Thank you both. This is the first of a couple sessions we'll have at the workshop, one today, this one, and one tomorrow. Very forward-looking material. This is forward-looking with regard to the next version of CIP 14-4, and we'll have more to say about that. Adjacency is a part of that. The session at 10 minutes to 10 tomorrow will be about Project 2016-02, and that's about virtualization and a lot of changes coming to the CIP standards, and we want to give you an update on that. Some of you might be thinking, CIP 14 doesn't apply to me. I can catch up on email. Let me give a different spin on that. We're really talking about physical security and practices in general with regard to securing our critical infrastructure. Whether or not CIP 14 is in your entity, there's a lot of material here that I hope will get you thinking about what you can do for substations regardless of impact rating. So give you that invitation. Kim, I want to thank you for keeping time for me. That keeping time is not an easy role. So, you just really appreciate you taking that. Thank you. Okay. Greg, great presentation, Greg. You got me worried about some things there. I appreciate that. How many are learning to be comfortable with uncertainty? It's kind of right? It's kind of the thing. This idea that we're going to know exactly what to do and boom, 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 and we can check that world seems to have vanished. So it's really an interesting time to live, and I'm very happy to be part of this time. If you're new to all of this, please just raise your hand at some point and say, that didn't make any sense, or ask a question later, because we're going to be getting into some weeds here with a couple of the questions. All right. Let's keep going. I'm not going to speak to every news item here on this slide. This slide is about, why are we talking about CIP 14? What is it about physical security? Why is it a risk category, as Greg demonstrated for us? And I'm going to ask Brady to give some commentary on that and why CIP 14 should matter to us more than ever. Brady?
Yeah, thank you. I have two thoughts on this. And the basic one is, if you are performing these studies and identifying CIP 14 critical facilities that do need physical protections, these are our most critical sites. So a loss of them could have an impact of, loss of service to millions of people, affect our national security and economic stability in this country. So that's the big one. But also I see it from a physical security practitioner perspective, having been at entities. I've worked at 2 different entities on physical security, including CIP 14 for them. This standard gives those physical security people a little bit of teeth to do their job better. Physical security is a cost category. We don't make money for the entities. It's hard to create metrics that show how effective we are, because if we're doing good, nothing's happening. Well, if nothing's happening, why are we spending the money? And I think this standard, as it's grown over the last 6 years that I've been at WEC, we've seen great improvements in the physical security of our substations. On another topic might lead to a target shift in some of the other substations that don't have that. But to Tom's point, applying some of the principles of CIP 14 and how we identify substations, how we conduct threat and vulnerability assessments, can apply to some of our other substations that aren't applicable to help with that target shift that we might be seeing in the industry.
Thank you, Brady. I appreciate that. And from a risk assessment point of view, that's really what we'll be getting into here at this point. So Brady spoke from a pure physical security perspective. CIP 14 is such an interesting standard. It's like 2 standards. We've got this more planning-oriented, transmission-oriented physical infrastructure. These things come together in CIP 14, and it really requires a diverse set of skills, and it's really fascinating area to be involved with. Here's what we're going to talk about today, and we'll be talking about the FERC order that led to this. We'll tell you about the SAR, the Standard Authorization Request for the next version of CIP 14. Jamie will have some information on where we are in the ballot process, and perhaps even what is a ballot process. That might be new to some people here. We'll be getting into a key difference between a transmission planning TPL perspective and a CIP 14 perspective with regard to complete loss of service in regards to CIP 14. We'll talk a little bit about considerations for load loss criteria, and we'll finish up with the topic that started all this, adjacency or proximity, and also some line of sight. So let's get into the questions. And Jamie, first, could you summarize for us the key points in FERC's order to evaluate? Oh, did I go ahead too far? Nope, sorry. Yes. There we are. First question, sorry about that. If you could summarize for us the key points in FERC's order and why are we evaluating the effectiveness of CIP 14? And I'm going to show in the background here the FERC order just for context.
Yeah, so identified through some of the FERC-led audits and conversations both with NERC, doing the CIP feedback loop, and of course, various conversations with entities, there were some inconsistencies that we identified and that FERC identified, which is how CIP 14 risk assessments, that's that first part, the more O&P related aspects of CIP 14 that were being applied throughout industry. The concerns being that there might be an inconsistency in how things were being determined, whether or not we were looking at this collection of assets the same way and perhaps missing something. So 3 points came out of the FERC report that was ordered to NERC to, or the FERC ordered to NERC to create a report addressing whether or not the applicability list that takes up SIP 14's determination of what shall be evaluated and whether or not that was appropriate. So we had to do some analysis for that. The second point being whether or not the risk assessment itself, just how there was some differences in how steady state and dynamics were being done, what type of thresholds were being evaluated in determining the criticality of a station, was just pretty widely diverse across multiple interconnections. And thirdly was a question on whether or not that there should be a minimal level of security protection at all substations that were either BES or otherwise. So we put together our report and filed that with FERC. It's currently available on our website, and we go into detail in regards to what we felt from our own analysis was appropriate. We can get into the applicability list discussion. We can get into some of the risk assessment discussion. Those two pieces really comprise the scope of the SAR, which we'll be talking about soon.
Yeah.
But that was really the impetus of the report. It came from some audits, seeing that inconsistency, and our report initiated a subsequent action to start a SAR, start a standards development project to refine SIP 14 for a later version.
Thank you, Jamie. That's a nice summary. Brady, I remember 6 years ago and earlier when we'd hear things like, SIP 14 is not even auditable because it's not prescriptive enough, or it's not this, or it's not that. So SIP 14, we really wrapped our minds around what effectiveness means when we're looking at a compliance standard. I wonder, you've been involved in this whole process, and I wonder if you could comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, this really goes back to just the basics of physical security. And when you talk effectiveness, it's, you have to have controls that deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and respond to the threats that you've identified in R4. And so one of the things that we look at when we're auditing, and my perspective on auditing is I have two missions when I'm visiting you and auditing your SIP 14 program. There's the minimum language of the standard, which is auditable, and then there's also the security objective. So I want to look at both. The security objective is how can we help each other improve our security program through effectiveness, but then also, I try really hard not to step outside of the lines of what is the minimum compliance standard and holding the entities to that, and then hopefully growing that program through the security objective. So while in version 4, the language for what to do once you've deemed a site critical hasn't changed much, I think what we're going to talk about a lot today is the potential for how those studies are going to change and how they might affect the physical security that you have to do at your sites.
Thank you, Brady. All right, let's segue now. As Jamie alluded, we'll be talking about the standard authorization request for the next version of SIP 14. And as Greg mentioned also, when we see a gap in remediating and mitigating the risks we observe in the function of the bulk electric system, sometimes the answer is to develop a new standard or a new version of a standard. And in this case, we're developing a new version of a standard, SIP 14, and associated with that standard authorization request should be some reliability and security benefits. So on the screen before you are the 5 main points in the standard authorization request. Jamie, first, what is a SAR from all the perspectives you can mention for us here, because we have many, and could you highlight some of the key benefits that we're seeking from this SAR in particular? Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm still working on the Schoolhouse Rock version of what is a SAR, but it's going to be coming. But what happens when we identify a reliability risk? And that can be done through any variety of mechanisms, like I said, through the CMEP process, or it's identified by some entity or stakeholder group. What happens to revise a SAR or to revise a standard is that a standard authorization request, it identifies a reliability risk, it identifies a particular scope of what needs to be done to mitigate that risk. And a good SAR doesn't specify a specific solution. It specifies what shall be done, what needs to be done to address that risk. This goes in line with what we're trying to do with standards to have requirements that are objective-based, performance-based, or risk-based. So we're not looking at just overly prescriptive standards that say, do X, then do this, and it's a process or procedure document. So what was identified through this process was the need to draft a SAR to revise this CIP 14 version to address the issues that we identified in the report. So NERC staff, as we had a hand in writing that report, we put together the SAR, we submitted it to our into the beginning of our process, which is to coordinate with our standards committee, which is an external entity, industry body that oversees our process and assures that we're implementing it effectively. What we need to do is then post it for comment. It goes through a formal comment review. It then gets assigned to a new drafting team. We solicit for industry members to be on that team. I always try to use these opportunities to get people involved. If you either don't like standards or you're really interested in making them better, you can either be on a team as a member or even just join as an observer and participate in the process. We facilitate the standards development process here, but NERC won't be drafting in terms of writing the standards itself. That is an industry-facing task. So the goal here with our SAR was to address the issues that you see on the screen, that the drafting team should seek to revise the current version of CIP 14 to address the issues that we identified in our report. So the three things that we identified, the applicability list, the risk assessment, those are outlined in a couple points here. So making sure that we had clear basis for how you're evaluating for those evil three, the adverse conditions of instability, uncontrolled separation, and cascading, having a technical rationale for how you support that decision and basically what decisions were made and why they were made. Can you substantiate why you made those decisions? Assuring that there is a consistency between those reports, and of course the applicability list, how that aligns with your other projects that you develop, your model development projects. If you have a 30, 60-month rotation, as in the current CIP 14 standard, I would be very surprised. The model development process is generally done on some sort of annual basis. TPL1 is generally done on an annual basis. And at 30, 60 months was not consistent. So there's some things that we addressed here. What you don't see is that third point, which looked at a minimum level of security protections for all BES facilities. Within our report, we identified that we didn't want to detract from the scope or the purpose of CIP 14, which was, as Brady very clearly outlined, was to find those very critical points in the system and not just to raise the bar for all substations. I think as our CEO said, don't build Fort Knox around a penny. Having substations built to the severity of a CIP 14 protection program would be unreasonably expensive, and we want to make sure that we're assigning resources appropriately. There's more work to be had in that, but that's not found in this current SAR. But essentially, that's what the scope of this team is tasked to do. You can see clarify objective-based statements, and the team's been working on interpreting that, putting out different versions to industry, to comments. Currently, it's under ballot.
Yeah.
So right now, that is open for final comment and final voting for draft 2 of that revised process.
Thank you, Jamie. Perfect segue. Before we get to the ballot, I think a really important concept is this idea of written by industry for industry. Could you share a little bit more about that? I'd really like everyone to understand that these are also your standards.
Yeah, NERC does something, well, our industry does something that is unique. It's unique to the world, where industry has a direct hand in crafting these standards. We are authorized by the U.S. Congress, and we're under the jurisdiction of the FERC to run this process and to develop standards. We facilitate this process, but it goes through open vetting and comment and revisions with industry. So where there's a need to see better standards, revised standards, is solely dependent on the fact that we have industry participants who are invested in this process, who are invested in seeing successful quality standards be developed and in a timely manner. As we've seen, things are starting to speed up, technology starting to speed up, things are becoming more complicated. So we're needing to be a little bit more agile. And so our process is going to change slightly as we adjust to this new paradigm of everything's happening all the time and moving quicker. So that means more communication and coordination, especially through forums like this. And thank you for WEC for having me here. Where we want to do is take this into the next iteration of standards, where if you don't have the time commitment to be on a team as a team member, especially on some of these high priority projects that do take a lot of time, you can still even just call in and observe and get where we are in the process, ask questions, reach out to the developers, and just be part of it. So it's a very unique process. It works when people buy in. It works the more people participate, and it works the more thorough our comments are. I tell people, like, hammer us on those comments early on, and do it early so we can make sure that we get to a final draft sooner rather than coming in, near the end of the process. But also, the more thorough those comments are, the better quality standards we're going to end up getting.
Thank you, Jamie. First, you're welcome. It's our pleasure to have you always. And before we talk about the ballot process itself, please pause and consider that an invitation to get involved. We have people in the audience who are very experienced on the drafting teams. It's really a pretty exciting opportunity. And as Jamie pointed out, there are different levels of involvement, including observer. So it can be customized to the time available to you. Okay, what is a ballot? Why do we do it? And where are we with the current ballot process for CIP 14-4?
So the process is, of course, open and transparent, so anyone can call in at any time. We do have trade press. We go through the antitrust statements for every call. But what we end up doing with each iteration of the standards is we go out to a public voting. So within our system, we do have it posted. And then we collect not only comments, but for each draft near the end of that comment period, we have an open period where we have a voting system, yay or nay on whether or not the project meets the scope of the SAR. And if there are any concerns that need to be addressed, that those are captured through that process. It's not the only way that we collect comments. We're actually looking to see what other ways that we can collect comments earlier on without going through the delayed process of balloting. But it is an essential piece to ensure how industry feels about the current draft and whether or not it meets the risk or not, whether or not it's reasonable, whether or not it's auditable, and whether or not it's just. So there's going to be some variety of viewpoints on each of those drafts and for each of the standards, but we need to make sure that we're accommodating all of those opinions and making sure that we can create standards that work for the enterprise as a whole. It's challenging if folks are looking at, here's my system, here's how it operates for me, so I'm going to vote no. But we want to encourage folks to look at that wider area. Some folks work in markets, some folks work in vertically integrated utilities. So there's going to be a variety of differences of opinions on how something should be done. So we look for objectives. Can you accomplish this? Or if it's a performance-based objective, whatever you do, assure that this level of performance is met on a minimum every time. And making sure that we can see how you got to that is part of the justification, documentation of criteria, which may seem like a paper exercise or administrative burden, but it's essential for us to have the facts and circumstances override a prescriptive standard. We want to be able to allow folks to be able to get to the solution in their own terms in a way that makes sense and is technically reasonable and supported. So that type of conversation is happening during the drafting teams. It's happening during the comment periods. And ultimately, the ballot is where we determine whether or not we've achieved our minimum 2/3 requirement. If we get a passing rate of 67%, we consider it passed and we move on, take it to our board, and then take it to FERC for filing.
Thank you, Jamie. And where are we today in the ballot process for CIP 14-4?
CIP 14 is currently under ballot, so I won't be able to entertain like a lot of back and forth discussion about it, but I can talk to the project, of course, and I can speak to the current standard as it's been currently communicated through the drafting team, through open webinars, but currently it's under ballot. That ballot closes on November 4th. or November 6th.
I think 6th.
I think it's the 6th.
Yeah.
We have a couple overlapping ballots right now. So that one's going to be closing on November 6th. So if you are part of the community and in that ballot pool, please do get in on that and make sure your vote is heard.
Very good. Thank you. We're going to make a transition now. This is your opportunity for audience participation. What is that? It's a crater. It's a smoking hole. Okay. So we're going to talk about why do we care about smoking holes and cratered substations with regard to CIP 14. And the first question we have, sorry. Okay, suddenly we're going to get a bit technical here. And Jamie, what's the difference between a transient and a dynamic stability study? And why do we include dynamic studies in a CIP 14 risk assessment?
So when you're doing an electrical study, there's a lot of different electrical characteristics that you want to study for. There's actually a variety of transient studies, and same with dynamic stability. But in short, if I were to summarize it, when you're looking at a transient study, you're looking at a high impact, like a lightning strike or a capacitor switching bank that could potentially cause the nearby elements to come out of phase, come out of synchronicity. If they become unsynchronized, they're more than likely to trip. You may end up having a collapse of like a magnetic field, which is, if you're familiar with like core concepts of electromagnetic theory, if you've got a current going through a line, you've got a magnetic field around it. And if that collapses, then you are gonna have to start that system back up from scratch. And it's probably not gonna connect appropriately. You end up with a larger gap in time delay in getting reconnected. It essentially trips. So transient studies are really looking at more localized impacts, like immediate concerns on whether or not the nearby elements are going to be able to stay in sync and don't trip. You may end up in situations where these are computationally excessive and you're not able to study a wider area. You're looking at very localized impacts. Dynamic is a little different. It's looking at over a longer period of time, whereas transient may be looking in individual cycles. Dynamics could go from cycles to seconds to maybe half minute, where you're looking at how nearby controllers, protection systems are responding, whether or not they're going to be able to respond appropriately, and whether or not things are going to be stable. So when we talk about dynamic stability or looking at an instability type assessment, a dynamic stability study is essential to determine whether or not the nearby elements can course correct to accommodate that change in either a loss of load or loss of generation, or say a lightning strike as well, like whether or not there's going to be the ability for those devices to accommodate and course correct, maintain voltage and frequency within a certain threshold. And that would be what you're looking at a dynamic. It's a wider area type assessment where you're looking just overall, can the loss of these elements be accommodated by the remaining system?
Thank you, Jamie. I was watching some thought bubbles for the CIP SMEs and the heads were starting to explode and I was seeing things like, whoo, I'm glad I don't have to worry about that stuff. Well, let me share my own story. I didn't worry about that stuff for a long time. CIP is my training. I can't tell you how much fun I'm having learning about all this and how much more relevant it has made my work to understand some of the details about like this much about how the grid actually works. It makes the cyber stuff so much more relevant. So another invitation, and we're going to move to the next question here. Jamie, can you describe, and ideally from a beginner's perspective, what does delayed clearing mean and why do we talk about it in regard to CIP 14 reliability studies? Thank you.
Yeah, so an example I have is, let's replace my substation with my car. And I'm not the best driver, I'm not the worst, but let's say somebody found my car in a parking lot and just went at it like they did with the Metcalf station. Shot out a tire, shot up my trunk. Well, my first protection scheme would be to take the spare out of the car, attach it, and then I'd be on my merry way. But lo and behold, the spare was shot too, and now I have to call AAA or a friend to come bring me a spare tire. That's kind of how I think about delayed clearing. You have localized protection systems that measure and detect faults within a system, and you have different zones of protection. The zone 1 protections that you're inside a substation, they're protection devices that say something has happened and they start triggering switches to or breakers to open and disconnect to what is isolating that fault, so it doesn't continue to propagate down into the system and affect other substations or other facilities. So delayed clearing is essential because during an attack on a substation, you may not have that spare tire. You may have those devices be not functioning. They may have been damaged themselves. The safe assumption is that that local protection system is not available and or is not able to respond appropriately. And so the delayed clearing is what is downstream looking towards your system. So if you have fault detection at your facility, you're not just looking internally, you're looking down each of the transmission lines to determine if there's faults further away. And there will be an intentional delay that will disconnect and isolate that fault if you detect it and it's not isolating down at the other end. That is the intention of delayed clearing. It is a redundancy. So this redundancy has a built-in time delay, and it's intentional. But that's what's expected in the CIP 14 studies, is the assumption that your local protection system will not be available and you will have to rely on this delayed clearing from outside protection systems that are looking in.
Thank you. I love that analogy. I felt like I learned a great deal in that moment there. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit based on a conversation I had earlier this morning, actually. So my transmission planners have already done their assessments. Am I done? What more do I have to do for CIP 14? Jamie?
Yeah, I have thoughts. Well, it starts with the model. So TPL has a specific time and place, has a specific purpose. It goes through looking at the model that you have for your area, and you are running contingency analysis. You're taking out individual facilities at a time, whole transmission lines, or you're taking out transformers. There's a variety of different contingencies that you're running, and you're determining whether or not your system can survive each of these. This is long-term planning. It allows you to determine whether or not you need to build additional substations or put in some additional reactive devices. There's a slew of corrective action plans, but the first aspect of it is, what's my risk if something happens in a very normal situation where I have to have some disconnect or some contingency occurs? The reason that CIP 14 is different is that you're not looking at the same type of analysis. You're looking at an analysis that's taking out lots of elements near the same time, if not instantaneously. And you're not just looking at things that are electrically connected. So I'm doing my own TPL assessment. I'm looking at my facilities. I'm running contingency analysis, taking out everything. I've got a shared facility where I've got my neighbor who owns this substation equipment. They've got their own transformer. They've got their own feeders or line going out, and it's in the same fence. Whether or not that's being covered in TPL is unlikely. Whether or not it has to be covered in CIP 14 is very, very true. The expectation that a physical attack is only going to attack your specific elements, or if you've got a nearby sub that it's only going to protect or attack your specific elements, is completely novel and unique to the CIP 14 risk assessment. There's a level of conversation on the applicability list development and where we're looking at what is the state of my system after 3 years as new lines come online, projected for installation of new equipment and new generators. Whether or not those are going to be done in the same time frame is something that we identified as being inconsistent.
Thank you, Jamie. That was awesome. We already began to answer this question. For the note takers out there, I noted the phrase nearly the same time, if not instantaneously. I think that's a key phrase to take away from this. On that subject, so here's a hypothetical. The likelihood of something like that happening, of an instantaneous event that faults an entire substation, poof, smoking hole gone. So unlikely. Why are we studying this? Why are we studying this? Do I need to study a scenario of a smoking hole, a complete loss of service?
So there's something to be said for what is instantaneous to a normal person who's observing an event and
Yeah.
what the system sees electrically. Even a plane going into a substation and taking out a variety of elements, there will be at least microseconds or maybe even full seconds as things are being taken out. One of the things that came up during the last round of the CIP 14 projects comment period was the three-phase bolted fault, which is essentially saying I've got a three-phase line and I apply a simultaneous fault against like my largest line coming in. Some of the comments from that last draft were, this is an unreasonable expectation. This is unlikely to occur. A counter argument being that we would want to study the worst case to determine what is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And that would be what we'd want to assure we can sustain, or ensure stability for. So there's a conversation that's still going on within those drafting teams. The current draft has removed that three-phase bolted fault, and it's now using just the defined term fault. Whether or not it needs to be studied in such a scenario is going to be part of the conversation still within that CIP 14 project, and that is still ongoing. So where that is going is not entirely clear right now because I can't comment on that, but we do have an expectation that that will be resolved in this next project.
I love the mystery here. It's like,
The only way you'll know is if you get involved.
okay, thank you. Here's a question we often get. Why can't NERC or WEC or someone provide the load loss criteria I need to use in my studies? But first, Jamie, what is load loss and what does load loss mean in the context of CIP 14? And why can't we just say, yes, use 1,000 megawatts?
Yeah, if you equate it to, I don't want to mix metaphors, so let me not do that. But when you're looking at load loss, it's essentially very difficult for NERC to come out with any specific criteria. And the rationale is being your system is entirely unique. And where you have load loss matters. What the megawatt value of that load loss is matters. And there's the same conversation for generation loss. What impacts that has to your system is going to be case dependent. So you may have a wider area planning coordinator, reliability coordinator set of criteria, or it's developed by your transmission planner. And if the rationale is consistency with the planners because they've based those determinations on some sort of study or analysis, there's a high degree of complementary technical rationale there because it's based off of some study. So if it's based off of a number that NERC gave, it wouldn't be technically substantive. There wouldn't be a rationale as to why 500 or why 700 megawatts. If your system can survive 500 megawatts and pretty much anywhere in the location of your system or footprint, then that's generally going to be an okay value. And if anything above that generally starts to become a little bit more iffy, eventually there does have to be a line. Maybe it's a range. There's going to have to be some conversations that are had with the transmission planner and planning coordinator to ensure that it's based off of an evaluation of study. This is an interesting standard because it's applicable to the transmission owner who may or may not have those capabilities in-house. So we want to ensure that the values that are being put in here are consistent. If there's a reason to have them different than what the PC or RC has, it's really what is the rationale for those deviations? It may make sense for your footprint, it may not. So it's really understanding why you chose what you chose and less about a specific number that we expect to see. The technical rationale is more important than the number itself, because if it's not based off of this technically substantive study or decision-making process or body of work or working group's decision, it's going to be suspect. because just the number by itself doesn't have the same value.
Thank you, Jamie. We are aware of some unlearning that needs to happen in the ERO with regard to a set figure for load loss to be used in CIP 14 studies. And that's a big part actually of this new version of the standard. We're going to switch gears finally to adjacency and talk about proximity and line of sight also. First question for Jamie, and Brady, we'll get you involved here in very short order. Jamie, are adjacency and proximity synonymous, and do they imply being electrically connected?
So physical adjacency and electrical adjacency, yeah, we don't really have those terms defined. We don't have defined terms for proximity. When we're in the terms of CIP 14, what we're talking about, and I alluded to this earlier,
Yeah.
in that a attacker is more than likely not going to be discriminate that on what they attack. It's going to be everything that they can attack, everything within that substation, or maybe they just strike the biggest equipment. It's possible that they're going after a particular owner or entity, but it's unlikely. With the more likely situation and the more severe situation is that when we talk about the smoking hole scenario, or we're talking about explosives, or we're talking about any form of ballistics, it's not going to care about who owns that equipment. So, and whether or not in the, say, the TPL studies, you're looking at whether or not you trip something in a particular 245 kV line or like a 115 kV line, and you're looking on whether or not those electrically connected systems can sustain. What happens in the physical security standpoint is we expect everything that's physically next to each other to be removed and to be considered inoperable or damaged. So it's wildly unique to the type of risk assessment that we would generally see in an O&P study.
Thank you, Jamie. And wow, it's as if we planned these segues. So Brady, what does proximity mean to you?
Yeah, so to that point, the adjacency and proximity thing, I have two thoughts on it. Obviously, it's what you can see is what you can attack. However, part of CIP 14R4, which is a little bit contrary to what adjacency or proximity is you're performing your own studies on what your threat is, why they are attacking you, and what their capabilities are. So if you look at an entity that's highly visible, that and if you are up to date on any of the intelligence that's coming in for the threat actors that are alive for our industry right now, is they have an idea of what sites they want to attack. I've seen the list. Some of it's bad and some of it's wrong. So the bad ones are the ones we don't want them to attack, and then the ones they got wrong just kind of show that they're not quite there with it and understanding, and that's a good thing, on what our most critical sites are. However, if you have two substations owned by two different entities, the point of R4 is these individuals that want to conduct these attacks, that want to cause instability, cascading, and separation, are probably going to know that this substation is more important than this one. So they would focus their efforts on that. So we have to be careful with the adjacency thing. Maybe not assume that everything's going to be attacked, but it's going to be critical, that they're going to attack the critical components. But then that leads to, are they insiders or not? How do they know what's important? So you have threats from multiple spectrums here, ones that are going to just shoot at the biggest, most important looking stuff, and you're going to have ones that are going to attack what is actually critical and in the specific order that it needs to be done. But proximity, I'll have more to say on that in the line of sight part of that, but I wanted to make that distinction that you get to write your own test in R4, and nothing in version 4 that I've seen so far of CIP 14 is changing how we conduct our threat and vulnerability assessments. And if you believe that your threat, which is based on geographic proximity, likelihood of attack, prior history of attack, those kind of things, are going to attack your specific substation and your specific assets for a reason, you get to say that.
Thank you, Brady. Okay, here's a scenario. Here's a question we've received. There are many scenarios. This is just one. So the scenario is, from an entity perspective, I own a non-critical substation, adjacent, proximate. We can just let that be for now what that means, next to another entity's critical substation. So the context of multiple entities is awesome here, and that's what we're talking about. Jamie, from your perspective, how would an entity approach studying this situation?
Yeah, and it gets a lot more interesting. So the owner or the responsibility of the critical substation is the one that would be initiating that. There does need to be coordination with removing or having that non-critical substation that's considered to be physically adjacent. Currently within the version of CIP 14 is requiring that there's going to have to be some level of coordination in determining that applicability list, what's going to be evaluated within the risk assessment. At this point, I would be remiss not to point out that we do have the chair of the CIP 14 in the crowd today. So if there's anything that you don't like about what I say, I would say, please go check with Carl Furman over here. He's been fantastic to work with and working on this team. So
He's wearing a blue shirt.
that's right, right there. No, and just appreciate all the work that he's been doing with the drafting team as well. But we do have a lot of questions that need to be resolved here as we put together additional guidance. Once the standards development process is completed and then we go through the FERC filing, then it gets into the compliance realm and there's a lot of questions. Well, what about this specific fact and circumstance? What about this configuration and how do I do that? So it would be challenging to say how specifically for every scenario generically. But what I would say is that if you have the critical substation, the obligation is yours to
Thank you.
initiate that study and then follow through.
Thank you, Jamie. This reminds me of a question we often get. Hey, can we just get your audit approach on this, that, or the other thing? The truth is that we need some field experience to understand what our approach can be. And this is a great example of where field experience helps inform our audit approach. So it's a more iterative process. We're going to switch gears now to line of sight. And Brady, we already know what line of sight is from vegetation management, right? In Fact 3, or are we talking about something else? Whoops.
Yeah, so the line of sight in Fact 3 is not a NERC-defined term as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know. And line of sight came up in the new standard, right? Or the one that they're working on over there. And I remember sitting in these teams as an observer myself and people asking, what does that mean? And I don't think it's clearly defined yet. I'm still waiting on Carl to do that. But I kid, and he's doing a great job keeping all that and going and moving forward. So I thought, I'm a physical security nerd. What do I like doing? I like writing white papers on my off time. So I kind of pulled from my experience of being in physical security and really, the Marine Corps and what I learned about line of sight from combat operations, things like that. And so I wrote a white paper on what does line of sight mean and how could that be used from adversaries to affect multiple substations. And I think a lot of this FERC order, in my opinion, comes from the increase in coordinated attacks against facilities that have happened over the last couple of years. Granted, those were at distribution sites, but could that expand into CIP 14 site as well? And without getting into a lot of the details of what my white paper included, I came from the perspective of if somebody asked me to create an audit approach for CIP 14-4 online to the site today, how would I handle it? And what I looked at is capabilities of what we have here in the US, from weapon systems to optics like night vision, thermal optics, laser rangefinders, spotting scopes, all of that. And how readily available is it? It's relatively cheap. For military, equipment these days, where in Arizona, I can get a thermal scope for my rifle for $3,000. Sounds like a lot, but when we're talking about quality, marksmanship type equipment, that's not a lot of money, and it's very doable for a lot of people. So how do we look at the capabilities of adversaries to see multiple facilities from one point, and how do we protect against that? Additionally, there's a lot of training online nowadays that teaches you how to be a precision shooter, how to be conduct line of sight assessments. You can download, U.S. Army manuals, although I highly recommend you instead download Marine Corps manuals because they'll be a lot better. Sorry, Mike, Steve, Nick. Anyways, yeah, they are. Yeah, a lot of colors, shapes, sounds. And when you apply this, I hope that, the work that I put into that could help, be a practice guide or something that can help the entities kind of determine what line of sight means. And where that stands right now is, willing to share that with the standards drafting team. Got the approval from NERC to share that white paper. So, happy to do that. But I think that's to go back to the original question, clear line of sight, fact 3, can you see it? In physical security is what tools are readily available, tools, training, and capabilities are readily available to enhance an attacker's ability to see further and be more effective.
Thank you, Brady, and congratulations on the white paper. I think that's awesome. Couple more questions here as we wrap up. Brady, what kind of distances are we talking about with regard to advanced optical technologies and the latest equipment out there?
Yeah, and that varies from your budget and your capabilities and what kind of threat actor you are. But bottom line, what I came down to through my analysis of, optics that let you see better in the dark, optics that let you see heat from a distance, optics that just let you see better in general. Okay, so this is all hypothetical. Let me put that caveat out there. But if somebody said, Brady, what do you do if it's a hill or a substation? I would put a 2,000 meter bubble around them. And if you have multiple facilities within that bubble, they all need to be studied together.
Thank you. 2,000 meters. Interesting, right? Okay. One more question, Brady. You already touched on coordinated multi-point attacks. Could you elaborate a bit more from the context of exploiting multiple adjacent substations at the same time?
Yeah. So back to my earlier comment of you get to develop your threat, right? So if your threat is, I'm just going to attack this one substation because that's our one CIP-14 site, that's what I need to protect. You also need to look at what the threats are actually saying. So if you go back to a couple of years ago, Amazon sold a book called Garden Issue Number 2, I believe it was. And it is from a radicalized group of environmental terrorists that wanted to see wants to see electricity gone. They want to go back to no electricity or anything like that. And in that, they listed a bunch of CIP-14 or substations. Some were CIP-14, some were not. But what they actually did that I found most interesting is they called Metcalf a failure. Metcalf was a failure because it did not cause instability, cascading, and separation. And it created the CIP-14 standard, which enhanced our physical security of our critical substations. So they saw that as a failure, and I keep cutting out. I hope that's okay. That one's bad. I'll take this one. Yeah, I know. Okay, I'm gonna try to finish out on this one right here. Okay, so yeah, they called it a failure, and they called for waiting and building up the ability to attack multiple substations at the same time. They saw that Metcalf being a one singular incident was a failure and that they needed to attack their list all at the same time. So our threat actors want to do this, so we need to balance the realistic nature of what is a threat based on the language of the standard in R4 and how we conduct our threat and vulnerability assessments. Be mindful of what's likely, but also be mindful of what they want to do. And I think that's the important aspect of multiple sites and multiple CIP-14 sites is just understanding they want to do it, but are they capable of doing it yet? We don't know. And then making sure that we're meeting that minimum language of being able to conduct these threat and vulnerability assessments, taking into account everything in R4.
Thank you, Brady. And is the timing of the attack strategically significant in some way?
I think it can be, I'm not a transmission guy, but I've had a lot of conversations in my site tours and walking around with these planners that timing does matter. If you are, if you have more load during the summer, obviously, your threats are going to be higher in the summer. Inverse of that is winter. So when you're conducting these threat and vulnerability assessments, look at what, when your most critical load times are and when an attack would have a higher consequence, because maybe it doesn't cause instability, cascading, and separation in the summer if you're a winter peak load entity.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow, what a privilege to work with you both. I thank you so much for joining us today on this session. Very interesting. We have a few minutes left for questions, and I thank you all very much. There are some resources in the slides that will be available.
Nick, I've been seeing your face. I might as well. I'm also waiting from Jenny from Tacoma Power. I never get to present without her asking me some questions too. Hard ones.
What weapon system are you seeing that has a 2,000 meter impact on substation equipment?
It's less about the weapon system and attacking the substation. It's being able to conduct the recon and surveillance with the enhanced optics and planning attacks on there with multiple, depending on how the site or the threats are developed.
Okay. So the other one is more on the proximity piece. I'll say one easy one at the end, but the proximity piece, having done a lot of these assessments and done a bit of target selection back in the Army without crayons.
Yeah.
Understand the proximity piece increasing the facility attractiveness for an attacker, but how does that change the facility's BES impact just by where it physically sits?
So, again, I'm going to caveat with I'm not a transmission planner, and I'm coming at this with, not a lot of developed reasoning for why line of sight and proximity is being included there. I'm coming at it strictly from a physical security person, thinking about the threshold that would make a site critical and need to have, and I'll call it R4 through 6 right now because it's not version 4 yet. But if you had 2 sites within that 2,000 meter bubble that did not hit the threshold of being applicable to CIP 14, however, studied together they would, then my thought and my educated wish or guess is that it's going to make them study together. And if they, in a combination, meet that megawatt threshold, then they would both be CIP 14 sites.
Well, and to expand on that, yeah, so the current the current structure of impact rating really does, the way that CIP 14 applicability works currently, it aligns with the CIP impact rating, the BES impact rating. So there's going to have to be an additional conversation. I know we had those conversations early on in the team, whether or not there needed to be a combined estimation or approximation of what that total line count would be, or we were evaluating them all together, and how would that proximity be determined, that you would do that proximity evaluation first and then do a line count. So there's still going to be some involvement as we go through, like this next iteration. There might be additional changes that look to add in an aggregate type assessment, but that's currently, I don't believe, within the scope.
Just one more quick one. This should be an easier one, but is there any consideration in CIP 14-4 to look at removing control centers, since the protections provided by CIP 6, from what I've seen, generally exceed what CIP 14 called for?
I would say currently no. There might even be a need to consider some additional facilities, but we're having those conversations. They're very preliminary. Where we're at right now is the scope of the SAW right now is driving what the revisions will be, but it's always an involvement of this conversation as our education of this matures, and not only that, but the attacks and our attackers mature. There's going to have to be continued discussions on what's appropriate and what's needed to be protected.
So I'd consider looking at that, because that's been something I know with a lot of the folks that I've worked with, even when I was auditing, it's hard to find a DBT that actually can create instability, separation, or cascading through a control center attack alone. So
Great perspective. Thank you. Time for one more question here, Doug.
All right. Hi, Doug.
Thanks.
You're standing between lunch, just so you know.
I'll make it quick.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom, Brady, Jamie. I'd like your thoughts, Jamie, on what would be What are your thoughts about using the facility rating as the largest load loss?
The largest facility rating that that entity owns, or just that?
No, of that
facility?
facility, since that's a conceivable loss.
So that, when we're looking at the load loss criteria, it's really for evaluating whether or not instability is going to occur. So if you determine that the loss of load from that facility is the criteria for evaluating whether or not there's instability, I think what ends up as a result there is that the loss of each facility will cause instability per that criteria. So I think it may not be the most appropriate if you were to use each individual facility's load that was connected as the determination of load loss, because I think you're always going to end up with determining instability in that result.
How about some percentage of it? I mean, what is the realistic loss?
The realistic loss is really going to be dependent on the studies that you do in the area, and this won't be determined through a CIP 14 risk assessment evaluation. It's probably going to be determined through either the transmission planners or even the RC study, looking at that wider area. They're taking out different parts of the system and saying, what's the largest amount of load that I could sustain and know that I can guarantee that I will stay stable, that I won't see uncontrolled separation. So it's going to be a number that might vary depending on even seasons. It may not even be a normal or single value. You might choose the lower of those two or the higher of those two, depending on your own analysis and rationale.
Sounds like a topic to be continued here. Thank you, Doug. That was a great question. Thank you very much, everybody. Good job.
Thank you to our panelists. Lunch will be served